So I think we do have time for questions?
Yes.
Or- Perfect. So we do have time for questions if anybody has any. If you could use the microphone.
We see in Colorado, local government, county governments, way outside the scope of our Constitution. The founders gave states rights to do different things, but don't they have to stay within the boundaries of what we put in the federal government, or what would you say to that?
So and that's a very good question, because that's a question they grappled with a lot at the time, was who does this Constitution most apply to? And for the most part, there's a test, if you will, within the Constitution to determine whether the state has the right or the ability to do something. And it's really three different tests you can run through pretty quickly. Does the Constitution expressly make a federal power exclusive? This really applies to a very small sect. Ironically, since we fought about this in the past year, the Constitution expressly gives the federal government jurisdiction over federal enclaves and the seat of power that was going to be set up, Washington, D.C. So if the Constitution very expressly gives that to the federal government, we know the states can't impede on it. If the Constitution prohibits the states from exercising that power, they also can. So things like tariffs, coining their own money, there's very specific articles within the Constitution that say states can't do this. The third test is to say, if a state had that ability to do it, does it necessarily make that national federal government rule meaningless? So for that one, it's something like naturalization, right? So the federal government has the ability to say, you're a United States citizen. If each state had its own sort of rules and sets for what a citizen actually was, well then why do we have a federal rule for it, right? So as long as it passes those three tests, and then of course we pass a constitutional amendment saying, hey, the Constitution is the law of the land, so we have a certain Bill of Rights that you have to abide by as well. If it falls outside of that, the Federalist said, and actually advocated and made the case for, no, your states do have that power, and they should have that power. Whether using that power is wise is a whole other question. And that's where we, the citizens, are responsible for telling our state government, no, that's not something you should do. Just because you can do it, just because the Constitution allows you to do it, does not make it a good idea. And this is where it's pretty difficult, because again, when you go back back when they were fighting over this, they were saying, hey, I want my states to be able to give my municipalities power to do certain things that affect us at a local level. And the Federalists said, if you're a virtuous people, you're going to be self-reliant enough on your own power and agency that whatever you don't want to happen to you, you're going to make sure that local government doesn't have that power and control. And he actually directly addresses this when he said they fight objections throughout this because they're newspaper articles, so they can say, hey, we read this interesting objection, here's actually why that's completely false. And they were going through these like doomsday objections. And at the very end, he basically says, listen, you can't create a government that can defend against all these doomsday scenarios. What's going to happen is if there's a society or people that allow that to happen, they're going to have to fight their own battles and make their own way out of it. So, unfortunately, they would say, it's our problem, maybe we didn't make it, but it is our responsibility and our duty to fix it. So, if that answers your question. Anybody else?
For all of their brilliance, there's one thing they didn't seem to do. Maybe you can talk to this for just a bit. Recognizing that people who gravitate towards governmental jobs want to be in power. They assign no term limits as to how long they had to become a power broker.
That's a very good point, and I suppose the way to say this is they actually did assume that people that wanted to be in government wanted power. What they didn't account for was that the legislative and the executive would get together and work together to create government bureaucracies that bypass both of the governments to create what we have today in the bureaucracy. So they always assumed that the legislative would want the power, that the executive would want the power, and that they would be constantly fighting. And that the legislative would say, hey, that executive agency is getting way too big. I want to limit that. And so the legislature would say, okay, whoa, we need to back off of this. What they never planned on was the executive and the legislative working together to create a power structure, and that's a problem we have today that we're going to have to deal with, right? But the argument is they kind of assumed they would always be fighting. And so now we have a problem we need to fix, because now we have this fourth branch of government, right? I believe that's a completely accurate way to say it. We have this fourth branch of government that now exists that wasn't in the original Constitution. So if we go back to how the Constitution was originally created, we may recreate it again. That's a good question for folks that want to create more governments. But did that answer your question a little bit?
It does. The other thing that seems to me that's strange, what we did do eventually, is we limit the leader's time. If you have a leader that's going in the right direction, I'd rather be formulating the people supporting him than having somebody come in and say, I'm going to do it different, and everybody goes, oh boy, it'll be different.
Right, so for those that couldn't hear, he said what they did is they actually limited the leader's time, not the actual government employees. And that's fair. Again, it comes into another interesting thing that we have, and we still do today, a standing army. So our army, not our Navy, the Navy was kind of set aside differently. Our army has to go through an apportionment every 2 years because the colonists were so scared of a standing army like Britain had, that they said, no, you have to come back and ask for money every 2 years in order to have a standing army, Mr. Executive, because we're scared of you becoming Caesar and just grabbing control of all of it. So there were parts of our government where they said, yeah, we do want you to not have people there all the time. But then there is this push-pull of, well, we kind of want that for the judicial a little bit, right? And there was always this assumption, hey, we're going to find out who the bad guys are in government, and when power changes hands, they're going to go. Now they're so protected, it's difficult to get them out. But again, that's something for us as citizens to hold our government accountable to, right? So, I think, and then one more back there. Sorry.
Thank you. When were the Federalist Papers written and made available versus when the Declaration of Independence was signed?
Well after. So the Federalist Papers, I believe, were they were definitely 1786 and 1787, so shortly before the Constitution was signed, is when they were all written. So they've had ample history with the Declaration, with the Articles of Confederation. The Federalist Papers were written in a direct response to try and convince people to vote for the Constitution. So they were written after the Constitutional Convention, before New York finally signed on and said, okay, we'll ratify this whole constitutional thing. Because they saw that, and Hamilton especially was a New York delegate to the Constitutional Convention. His other two delegates really did not like the Constitutional Convention. Hardly ever showed up. And so he said, I think it was Governor Clinton at the time, said, we don't want to be a part of this, so we're going to object to this as strongly as I can. So Hamilton said, well, the best place to start is where the objection is most stringent and in a city I know best because I live there. So it was published across the country. Also, again, we have it in a book format now. It was individual newspaper articles when it was originally published. And actually, when he compiled this at the very end, there's an introduction where he says, listen, we had the option to kind of make this into a book format. We repeat ourselves a lot. We left it in there because if it's a good idea and we repeat it a lot, maybe you need it beat into your head a lot, so we're gonna leave the repetition in there, even though it's terrible literary style. So, when he repeats himself a lot, it's probably because he believes it's a good idea for the people at the time to listen to it and to hear it often in order for them to get the Constitution approved. So,
Having not seen Hamilton, in your opinion, is it accurate to the history?
from a lot of people that know history better than I, they said it's very, very well done. Yes, so, you know, it's also, there's probably better biographies to listen to and to read, but for the most part, it's very good. They get the conflict in there between the different characters, that's pretty historically accurate. A lot of the small little things, like Hamilton's fight for the national banks, very historically accurate. So again, from people that know history better than I, they were very impressed with Hamilton and its historical accuracy. So, yeah, good question.
I realize you didn't answer this question on our car ride home, but I wanted to hear probably your brilliant answer to it. So you had mentioned that unfortunately we passed the 17th Amendment. And then you talked about how it is important for us to be a virtuous and engaged citizenry. Do you think that if we had not passed that and that we still had our representatives choosing our senators, that we as a body of citizens would be more engaged and more likely to be involved? Or do you think that that was just going to happen by, I guess, yeah.
Yeah. That's an excellent question. Very lovely person. I'd like to take on a date afterwards. Whether it would make us more engaged as citizens or not, I'm not sure. We would be more interested in our state legislatures than I think most people are right now. I think that could be a fairly good argument that, I mean, how many of your neighbors know your state representatives and state senators? I know this is a very politically active group, so you all probably do, but when you talk to your neighbors, do they? And I believe that's the argument made with the 17th Amendment passing, is now there's no longer this drive for senators to listen to their state legislators, and then by extension, the people to hold their state legislators accountable for their senators. So, whether culture would have changed downstream of that, or whether we just naturally drifted away from being a virtuous society, I'm not sure, but we would care a lot more about our state legislators at the very least. So.
Thank you, and I'm glad she asked about virtuous citizenship because you kind of asked us and said to be virtuous citizens. And I think it's important for people to know what is virtuous citizenship, because we can't be or aspire to do something if we don't know what we're being asked to do. And so I just want to give a little background on that, just and then final my question. So you can please help us, remind us what being virtuous citizenship, what virtuous citizenship is, because if we have fallen away from that, we need to know the pathway back. And the reason this is deeply personal to me is I grew up as an expat, so I didn't have much in the way of American history. I can talk to you all day about Mexican history, but when I was old enough and had to come to university, I had to come here and learn what being an American was, and I don't know what that was. I knew that I had a passport-carrying American, but I had no idea what that was. So I desperately started seeking what made the United States different from Latin America, which was in a free fall, and there was something that made it different. And when I learned a lot of these things, it wasn't until I found out about the virtues of citizenship that it all clicked. And the fact that we're moving away from them is what's making us start a free fall that other countries have had. So can you please remind us all of what are the virtues of citizenship we aspire to?
Yeah, so before I do though, I want to probably highlight why we're moving away from them. And there was a reason why they said religious people, this was made to be a religious country. And they didn't necessarily say what religion it had to be, but there's a reason why they said religious people tend to be virtuous people. And a lot of what we're seeing today is we're seeing a move away from religion towards this ideology that is less about religion. Every religion tends to think that there is some semblance of truth, that it's discoverable, that it's concrete, that you can find it, we're all seeking it, but there is truth and it can be discovered, it can be reasoned, and it can be found. What we're seeing now is more of a rise of ideologies that say truth is relative. And when you say truth is relative, well, how can you have virtue associated with that, right? Because, well, virtue can be whatever you mean it to be. So they said religious people will generally tend to be virtuous people, so this was made to be a religious country. And I do want to make the point, this is civic virtues. So lots of religions, lots of different ways of thinking, lots of different worldviews have different virtues that they promote more. In order to be a civically virtuous country, the good citizen that they envisioned and that gets repeated throughout the Federalist Papers is a citizen that has four main civic virtues. Self-reliance. They wanted to be self-reliant. They didn't want to rely on a government. They didn't want to rely on other people. They wanted to have their own personal agency. Self-restraint. There may be good things to say, but I'm going to restrain myself from saying it. Or I want to make sure and restrain myself from asking for the government to do more. So kind of tie together a little bit. Self-assertion. You need to be able to be involved in the public opinion, to be assertive enough to tell your legislators what you want and why you want it. You need to have that courage, if you will, to go out and be an active citizen. And then the last one, and the reason why I harp on the Federalist Papers so much, is you need to have civic knowledge of what you have. How can you keep the Constitution if you don't know what you're keeping? And so our country, even though, I know I mentioned it in kind of a throwaway line, we really have a very short constitutional document to govern 200 million people, don't we? I mean, I know we have a code of federal regulations that definitely would take a long time to replicate, but the Constitution, if we all sat down and copied word by word, would be over pretty quickly. But it's very purposeful then in its brevity in how it's constructed. And so if you have people that don't understand why, then they come in and say, the people should be able to vote for all our elected representatives, so we should get rid of state legislators electing senators. We should have the people vote their senators because the people are more important, because they don't know how and why the Senate was constructed the way it was. And so if you don't understand the machinations of why, then you lose out on the benefits of what it will then do for you. So I think that's, yeah, maybe do we want to do one more, or how much more time do we have? I could be here all night, so.
They can come up to you afterward too. One
Yeah.
more? One more? Sure. All right, last call.
Thank you. We also heard from a previous speaker a couple of years ago about the annotated Constitution. That's about 3,000 pages long. Now, which one is the Constitution is the question.
Well, I would say it's the Constitution we have written, and that would be, and again, I'll plug this one. I probably should have done it before some folks took off, but this is the Signet Classics edition of the Federalist Papers. It's got introduction notes by Charles Kessler. The very cool thing about this edition is when you turn to the back here, you can't really see it, but it has a constitution in the back that's annotated with the Federalist Papers, so that you could come in and you could say, hey, you know, I have our House of Representatives. What Federalist paper will teach me most about the House of Representatives and why it was constructed? And you'll sit here and you'll say, go to page 289, and you can start reading about it there. So I really like the original Declaration or Constitution as written, so I would say the original. This one is very helpful too in the fact that it has, let me find so you guys can see, this is kind of obvious. You'll see in this, you'll see like bold words. So there's a lot of history, a lot of, they mention a lot of things that are culturally relevant to the time it was written. And so when they went through this edition, they went through and they said, hey, I don't think people really are up with what the Achaean League is, or the Diet of Germany, and it's not sauerkraut and beer, so let's explain it just a little bit to help people read the Federalist Papers. And so I really advocate for this version because you can go in and see these historical references. You can pull up the Constitution and back. You can say, hey, I had a really interesting conversation. I don't think I agree with what they said, but let me come in and get some logic on why it was written the way it was written. So, but without having heard the talk, that's kind of the best I can give. They maybe have an excellent case I haven't heard. And maybe I'll be a believer in a little bit about the annotated version, but I doubt I like it. Do what? The Federalist Papers by the Signet Classics, Federalist Papers, and Introduction and Notes by Charles R. Kessler. So, I think if you look at Signet Classics, S-I-G-N-E-T Classics, and Federalist Papers, you'll be able to get a hold of it. So, perfect. Well, I want to thank, of course, my beautiful wife, Kim Munson, for letting me be on the show, and of course, Mark and the board for